Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is Louwrens. Botha. I'm a PhD candidate at Eindhoven University of Technology. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Supervised by Owana Druta, who we just met. And yeah, today I'll be talking a bit about our work in the Dutch context, focusing on Dutch neighborhood living rooms as prefigurative experiments and their role in everyday community resilience. So very briefly, the context we're working in, that's the Netherlands, for those who don't know it. I've been studying the cities of Rotterdam and Eindhoven. Rotterdam is part of the sort of big urban conglomeration in the northwest of the west of the country. It's the second biggest city in the Netherlands, very big port. Eindhoven is a much smaller city. It's a post-industrial city, and it plays more of a sort of regional role in a mostly rural region slightly in the periphery. It is known as the brain port because it's sort of reinvented itself as this knowledge economy and high-tech industry. Thanks, Juana. So as with the rest of the teams, we started off with mapping practices in these two cities, bottom-up practices, community-led, citizen-led, and I was trying to categorize them into this typology of sort of what kind of practices do we see. These were early efforts in the two cities, spaces of and practices of advocating, of meeting and making, greening, gardening, sustainable living, and experimenting. But somehow in between all of these categories, an interesting typology emerged, which is the buurthuiskamer. And this is a Dutch word that basically, well, it literally translates as the neighborhood living room. This is a sort of typology with a very long history in the Netherlands, originally in the self-organized sectors of society, the Catholics, the socialists, the liberals, they would all self-organize social infrastructure, which was then later formalized in the welfare state, then sort of collapsed under neoliberal reforms and is now being kind of reinvented in a bottom-up way by communities. So I'm interested in these spaces as spaces of possibility because they exist somehow beyond the market, the private home, or the state institution. It's like the normal rules don't really apply in these spaces, so people have to make up their own rules. They have to decide what they really want, how they want to act in the space, how they want to relate to each other. So I think how people then behave says something about their everyday needs and desires within the community, but also sort of tells us something about what Thompson calls proactive and playful visions and imaginaries of how the world could be different. So not only spaces of sort of community survival, but also of imagination and coming up with radical alternatives. And I think this is key to my understanding of resilience as not only being about reacting and surviving, adapting to what happens, but also individuals and communities having the ability to imagine and actively transform the future rather than only adapting to it. So I spent some time in 4 of these spaces, 2 of them in Eindhoven and 2 of them in Rotterdam, doing ethnographic fieldwork, which involved a lot of participant observation, casual conversations, myself taking part in their practices as much as possible, ultimately around 20 semi-structured interviews to really understand what it is people do in these spaces and why, what are the meanings they associate with their practices, along the way also trying to tap into the sort of local networks within these communities. And to briefly run through some of the key lessons that I think I've learned from this acting otherwise. The first is the importance of social connection and conviviality. So this is, I've called it both the how and the what. So people do things together because this is how they do things. But the fact of doing it together is also an inherent reward, even if it's sometimes more messy and difficult, inefficient compared to one person being a dictator and doing everything. Secondly, it was very clear from the interviews how people, as individuals and as communities, were transformed through these experiences, through experiencing and trying to cultivate a space of equality and vulnerability, telling your own story, having other people listen to and respond to your story, and then reciprocating by them telling their story to you. So people feel seen, they feel heard, they feel that they matter because of the opportunity to do this. The third very clear point was people's desire for change. A lot of the people I spoke to were coming from either burnout or unemployment or just dissatisfaction with working life or serious illness, bad experiences with the welfare system. So they actively, they were really looking for alternative ways to organize their everyday life. And not only did they want to live differently, once they experienced these alternatives, they were really driven by wanting to share this with others, to give others the same opportunity. And the fourth big theme from the interviews was the work that goes into holding open the space. So this is like the institutional and economic challenges of accessing space, paying the rent, keeping the lights on, paying the bills, but also the sort of emotional and energy burden that this places on people to do all this administration, the precarity of these spaces, the emotional energy that it costs. Some people were coming out of a burnout, ended up in these spaces, and then almost had another burnout because of the work that goes into sustaining these community spaces. Then I want to talk through two of the sort of big themes that I'm trying to write about at the moment as part of my PhD. The one is looking at these spaces as spaces of innovation. So the idea is that innovation, including social innovation, happens in niches that are somewhat protected from market pressures. So bureautized kameras are these kind of spaces that, like I said, sort of exist somewhat outside of the pressures of the rest of society. So they provide opportunity for people to come up with different ways of doing things, to experiment with alternatives, to test them out, and to sort of develop collective values, needs, desires, and alternative ways of meeting those needs. In doing this, I'm really influenced by the idea of prefiguration, which comes mostly from anarchist theory, which is about not necessarily knowing what the alternative is that you're developing it, but it's about performing it. And through performing it, you test it, you demonstrate it to other people, and you sort of can tinker with it, figure it out by trial and error. But at the same time, these niches aren't, they are quite precarious in themselves sometimes. And I'm interested in the dynamics of what are the forces that hold open these niches? Like, where does the funding come from that allows them to do this? And what forces do those in turn exert on the experiment itself? So you might be able to do this experiment because you get funding from somewhere or because you get a space from the housing association, but that funding or that space also comes with conditions, which maybe affects, how your experiment unfolds or what you can and can't do within this within your experiment. So there's this tension between initiatives trying to play the game and be successful while they're trying to change the rules of the game. And I think a third factor is for them to keep the game alive so that they can keep experimenting within this niche. The second theme I've been writing about is these bureautized kameras as spaces of care. So on the one hand, the sort of contemporary capitalist city produces deficits of care that people need to get together and work together to survive and to cope with. And that these bureautized kameras are a way for people to, basically survive the capitalist city. But beyond mere survival, the same as what I was saying about resilience, I also see an ethic of care as an imaginative act. So people's practices in these spaces sort of show and experiment with what could be possible, what could the city be like instead, beyond capitalism. So very much related to this exhibition as well. Not only surviving, but actually imagining alternatives beyond the current crisis and letting people experience those alternatives. And that bureautized kameras are a sort of infrastructure of care that make this possible in the present, but could also be a sort of bridge towards these futures by allowing people to keep sustaining these practices in their everyday lives. So this is a paper that should hopefully be published this summer, once I've submitted the final revisions this weekend. So look out for that. You will try to hurry, but one aspect that I think has been interesting is looking at the different organizational forms, because the bureautized kamera is one concept that everyone is familiar with, but different spaces interpret them in slightly different ways. There isn't one model. So some of these spaces try to be a piece of social infrastructure that really tries to be neutral, so it's for everyone. It's mediated by a third party, and they're really interested in equality and fairness and open access. But it also raises certain questions like, to what extent are people empowered by these spaces that are run by external professionals or welfare organizations? Do they really develop their own capacities, and do they take ownership when the space is kind of run for them? A different model is a more self-managed space where the municipality will support and facilitate, for example, by providing a space and a base level of funding, but a group of residents are sort of given the responsibility to run it on a day-to-day basis, which gives them a bit more autonomy, but again raises questions about whose interests are served. Is this just a sort of closed circle of insiders with the social capital to do what they want, or is it really inclusive? And if it's relying on sort of volunteers, on resident volunteers, who are the people that have the time and the skills to do this instead of having to work 40, 50 hours a week to survive? And then a third organizational form is a much more bottom-up radical association of equals with possibly an antagonistic relationship to the municipality, where they really oppose the dominant structures in trying to create alternatives. Again, I've sort of added some question marks to this, like who has the skills, the capacity to participate in this way, who can afford to take an antagonistic attitude towards the municipality, and how do you connect the sort of more oppositional radical act to wider change rather than marginalizing yourself as a bubble? These are questions without answers, by the way. So in this, you see this tension between the ideas of neutrality, social infrastructure where everyone is welcome, and identity, where people have the sense of belonging and commitment and safety because the space is theirs, it belongs to them. It's not just open and universal to everyone. And especially in sort of so-called difficult spaces, difficult contexts, this question is quite prevalent. Just continuing with some of the challenges these spaces face, I think we all know, and we've discussed it already today, the access to space is very difficult. These are often temporary use contracts. The space is provided free or subsidized by the housing association, and these spaces receive municipal subsidies or private subsidies, which always brings with it a reporting requirement. So you end up spending half your time reporting on what you've done with the money rather than actually putting the energy into doing something with it. And like I alluded to earlier, this also can have an influence on the content, what people are able to do. The second one is a question of scale. In some municipalities, they sort of assign one community space for a whole district or a very large neighborhood and just think that it should serve everyone, which is not the case. You have a lot of diverse groups, diverse needs that can't always coexist, but at the same time, you don't want every demographic group of society to have their own space and they never mix. So somewhere in between these two, there's this sort of perfect Goldilocks scale, theoretically. Thirdly, a recurring question is whether these people should be compensated for their time, and how do you do that? But also, how do you compensate people fairly without it sort of becoming a job or creating a divide between the sort of paid staff of the space and the users? And this, you do see this in some of these spaces where, if you are being paid to be there as a volunteer, you have certain rights or authority, and if you are just a normal person, there's a sort of hierarchy that becomes created. And finally, I think along with this, there are subsidies and support for these spaces, but often they're very complex and onerous. So one of the questions we're asking is how can these subsidies be simplified to let people focus on the actual work they're doing in the community rather than the administration, the funding applications, the reporting, and the stress that comes with it, while at the same time recognizing that a lot of these actors get a huge sense of ownership and investment and pride because they are self-sufficient. They aren't reliant on subsidies. They are sort of running it as a self-sufficient business. So again, there's a tension there, and often with these spaces, the municipality sort of expects them to become self-sufficient, have a business case, a business model that allows them to be autonomous, but I would question whether a community space should need a business case. And finally, just briefly mentioning what we're working on at the moment and sort of beyond the end of this project, because like Nicola says, these things don't stop once you put them in motion. We're currently working on we have a working document about neighborhood living rooms. And we're using this to facilitate dialogues with the municipality of Eindhoven as well as stakeholder groups like some of these Buurthuiskamers and other community actors to try and see how their needs can best be reflected in this document and how this document can shape municipal policy. Like at the moment, they're working on this innovation agenda and meeting place policy. So we're trying to sort of see how we can have influence on that in the most relevant way, and using this working document basically as a premise to get people around the table that wouldn't normally talk to each other. But Awana and I kind of saw this as a way as sort of the end of the project, like the culmination, but then we realized once you do this, it's actually just the start of a new trajectory and you can't just stop. So we're still figuring out how to take this forward. And at the same time, through this work, I've also become involved in this bottom-up network in Eindhoven called the Circuit of Commons, who are much more, it's a network of cultural and self-organized spaces in the city that are sort of fighting for the right to common space, the right to the city. They're collaborating with a project called La Casa Invisible in Malaga, and this exhibition at Van Abbe Museum, Art is a Verb, which, trying to use this exhibition as a sort of catalyst for organizing this network of spaces and helping them to sort of fight to preserve their right to the city and to be recognized by the city. So this was this pop-up demonstration we had just last week, actually, last Thursday, outside the city hall. So once you get involved, these things just continue. So we'll see how and when that ends, and if I ever extract myself from it. But yeah, that's it for today. Thanks.